I don't see how this argument over maximal minimal facts approach would shake people's faith. But if it did, then I might want to spend some time on it to help them out. But other than that, I just don't have time for what I regard as a silly matter.
Welcome to Potential Theism. My name is Jordan, and I am the Potential Theist. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Michael Licona. Mike, welcome to Potential Theism.
Well, thank you, Jordan.
So, I'm assuming most of our guests know, or excuse me, most of our audience knows who you are. But for anyone who might not know who you are, could you just introduce yourself?
Sure. I teach at. I'm a professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University, and yeah, I grew up in Baltimore. Became a Christian at the age of 10. When I was in graduate school, I started to have some doubts about my faith. Met Gary Habermas at that point and discussed the resurrection and was encouraged in my faith. But later on, had some doubts again. End up doing my PhD research on the resurrection of Jesus to conduct it as a historian would. When learned that when you're doing historical investigation, you have to recognize that no matter who you are, and I recognize that as a Christian, I was biased. There's no such thing as an unbiased historian, and the biases definitely can get in the way and compromise the integrity of an investigation. And being by nature a second guesser on so many things, even outside of faith. I really wanted to settle my doubts, and so I took a lot longer than most would for their doctorate. The average doctoral dissertation is 60 to 80,000 words. Mine was over 250,000 words. During that time, I tried to get in public debates with some of the leading skeptical minds out there to see if the case I wanted to present could withstand the toughest critical scrutiny. Yeah, that was my journey in studying the resurrection of Jesus. And since then, I spend most of my time now looking at the Gospels and are they historically reliable and historical Jesus studies.
Okay, and so you got yourself in a little bit of trouble with your view on Matthew 27. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So Danny Akin, the president of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, I want to read this quote from him. He said, particularly important is the near proximity of the resurrection passage in Matthew 28. In my judgment, this is the death knell to Dr. Licona's position and raises the stakes to a crucially high level. If you dehistorize one resurrection, what keeps you from dehistorizing the other? So what would be your response to Akin's question?
Well, all you have to do is to go to the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 through, 25, which is just a couple chapters before Jesus' death in chapter 27. And you find that Matthew does kind of the same stuff. Things that we would not take as being historical, they're more poetic or apocalyptic in its type of description. So Matthew is doing the very same thing there that Danny, who I like Danny, he's a good guy, but he's doing the same thing. Matthew's doing the same thing in the Olivet Discourse that Danny's saying he's not doing in Matthew 27. Now, how do we distinguish between the resurrection of the saints if we're going to say that's not historical and then the historicity of Jesus' resurrection? Well, at best, we can say that, or I should say this, at least we can say that it's dubious whether Matthew meant for us to understand the phenomena at Jesus's death, the darkness, the earthquake, the rocks splitting, the tombs open, things like that. It's questionable whether he meant that in historical terms. But when we come to the early Christians and what they were saying about the fate of Jesus, that's not questionable. You've got Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, who is linking the general resurrection of believers to the resurrection of Jesus and saying that It's all part of the general resurrection. Jesus started the general resurrection, and it will be concluded when he returns. The two are inextricably linked. So in verse 20, Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. Verse 23, each in their own order. Christ the first fruits. After that, those who belong to Christ at his coming. So the two are linked. So Paul goes on in that chapter, and he gives an argument something like this. If Christ has not been raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, the Christian life is not worth living. So let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But Christ has been raised, therefore we will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living. And that argument makes no sense whatsoever if the Paul and the original apostles did not intend to communicate that Jesus had actually historically been raised from the dead. In addition to that, I would add, let's look at how the earliest critics of Christianity, who we have clues of what they said, let's see how they interpreted what the Christians were saying. So you have Matthew in Matthew 28 saying that the Jewish leaders were propagating the story that the disciples stole the body, and that this story remains in circulation to this very day. So whenever Matthew was writing, whether it's the 60s, 70s, or 80s, the story was still being circulated. And then when we get to Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century in his dialogue with Trypho, he mentions that the Jewish leadership is still spreading the story that the disciples had stolen the body. Well, why is that significant? Because they're not trying to doubt the empty tomb. They're trying to explain it in natural terms. They're trying to explain why it was empty. You look at Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century, and he's saying that it was being spread that the gardener reburied the body of Jesus to keep those who were coming to venerate the tomb from trampling over his lettuce patch. Again, it's another reason for thinking that they're trying to explain why the tomb was empty, not denying it. And then we look at how the earliest Christians were responding to the earliest critics. They didn't say, well, you don't understand what we're saying here. We're not saying that Jesus was actually raised from the dead. We're just saying that resurrection was a metaphor to say he was exalted into heaven, or that his memories and teachings still live on. No, they defended the bodily historical event of the resurrection of Jesus. So in other words, the critics understood the earliest Christians as saying it was a historical event, and the earliest Christians, in responding to those critics, were affirming that it was a historical event. Everything in the text from beginning to end suggests that the earliest Christians, the followers of Jesus, intended to communicate that Jesus rose from the dead as a historical event. And that's why we definitely clearly interpret that one as them communicating that it was historical, whereas it's not nearly the same with Matthew's raised saints.
So I don't think any scholars would be surprised by anything you've written about the Gospels being ancient Greco-Roman biographies and their use of literary devices. But some of your fellow evangelicals seem kind of to have some knee-jerk reactions to that. Were you surprised by that?
Yes and no. I mean, as far as I know, it's not a whole lot of evangelicals who have responded in that way. It's just some of them. I think they're well-meaning, but I think they just have a wooden paradigm, and it's difficult for them to get out of it. They got certain views of what it means to say the Bible is divinely inspired or inerrant. And it's hard for them to think outside of the box of how they interpret inspiration and inerrancy. My dad would have had problems with it, I think. But that's just the way it is.
Okay, and when talking about harmonization attempts, you use this phrase that I really like, hermeneutical waterboarding. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah. I kind of stole that from Dale Allison in his book, Resurrecting Jesus from 2005. He didn't use hermeneutical waterboarding. I forgot how I think he said something like, sometimes people will want to stretch the texts until they tell them what they want to hear. And at that point, there was a few years ago, there was this debate going on whether it was wrong to waterboard terrorists in order to get information out of them. And I thought, we could call it hermeneutical waterboarding until you subject the gospels to hermeneutical waterboarding until they tell the torturer what they want to hear. And so, yeah. But when you do that to the text in order to try to harmonize it, I don't think you're showing respect for the text.
So you brought up like wooden views of inerrancy. Could you go over what your view of inerrancy is?
Sure. I would define the Bible as being inerrant in all that it teaches. It may not be inerrant on a number of details or some of its reports, but I'd say it's inerrant in all that it teaches.
So you allow for mistakes or like simple errors.
I allow for it. Yeah. I mean, let's face it, today, even stalwart conservatives like the late Norman Geisler and his co-author Thomas Howe and many others like Danny Akin, they would acknowledge that our current Bible has errors in it. Now, they would account for this usually by copyist error, that in during the process of copying the manuscript, some copyists introduced errors into it, and these have made their way into our current text. And so they say, well, inerrancy only applies to the originals, not to the current text. And the current text is inerrant insofar only as it conforms to the originals. And to that, I would just say, well, okay, so you're acknowledging that our current text is not inerrant. And God allowed the text to be corrupted to an extent, even though a very minor one. So could God have preserved an inerrant text and somehow, originals or copies that were inerrant in some clay jars that were hidden away, kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, of course, he could have done something like that, but he did not. And so the text that we have today does have some known errors in it. But that tells us that if God could have preserved an inerrant text and he did not, he must not have thought it was important for us to have an inerrant text. So I think a lot of Christians, evangelicals, will put more weight on inerrancy. It's more important to them than it is to God. And that's not a good position to be in.
Do you think it's more important to defend the reliability of the Gospels
Oh,
than
yeah,
say, yeah?
absolutely. And even with reliability, we have to define what we mean by that. I define, I think that when we speak of historical reliability, we have to speak of it in terms of that doesn't privilege it toward the Gospels. I think we have to take into account all ancient historical literatures. So whether that's Tacitus's Annals of Rome or Sallust's War with Catiline, or Plutarch's Lives or Polybius's Histories, what some are more accurate or reliable than others, but all of them took liberties with how they reported things that modern historians and biographers would not do. And of course, they didn't have video recorders. They didn't have computers that could save documents and, with the kind of precision that we have today. They don't have audio recordings. They didn't have iPhones, mobile phones that could record on the spot, be it audio or video. So what were they looking to do? What was their objective? And if we define historically reliable, it has to be in a sense that would apply to all historical literature. So I define it as it gives us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. And I think the Gospels do a good job at that. And in fact, I published an article a few years ago comparing Suetonius's Life of Augustus, which is regarded to be Suetonius's finest biography. And Suetonius is the biographer thought to write more like modern biographers than any other ancient biographer. So it's his finest biography. So if we're going to talk about something being historically reliable in terms of an ancient biography, that's the one. So let's apply certain criteria to see how we would look at Suetonius's Life of Augustus. And then I took those same criteria and applied it to the Gospel of Mark and found that Gospel of Mark came out just as well as Suetonius's Life of Augustus.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. As you know, Bart Ehrman often brings up Marian apparitions when talking about the resurrection, especially with Protestants. So I've interviewed Catholic apologist Trent Horn, and I've heard him say that the evidence for some Marian apparitions is better than the evidence for the resurrection. I also saw a quote recently where you seem to imply that Marian apparitions may be due to demonic activity. So, do you see how an atheist could see you sort of becoming a skeptic when it comes to supernatural events outside of your own tradition, including ones that are better evidence than the resurrection, and yet you're not as skeptical when it comes to supernatural events that are in line with your tradition?
Sure, I can see how they would interpret that, especially if they're not hearing me within the context and the fuller content comments that I make when I'm asked that question. So, I'm not one who would deny that there was some kind of a phenomena going on, probably even a supernatural kind of phenomena with many of these Marian apparitions. Now, some of them, like I see Mary in the sandwich, this piece of toast here, or I see Mary on the side of this building that has windows that are like mirrors. I mean, some of those are kind of forced and not impressive to most of us. But some of those, like you have with Lourdes, Medjugorje, the Coptic Church in Egypt, it seems to me that there is some kind of a phenomena going on that is difficult to explain in natural terms, especially some of the more current ones, like at the Coptic Church in Egypt. I think it was 1968 or 69. But in these cases, um, it's like um, Medjugorje. Okay, so this is the one that you brought up about the demonic things. Okay, um, my friend Ken Samples actually went over to there to speak to one of the seers who was involved and has these apparitions of Mary. And he says he was actually present when the seer was experiencing an apparition of Mary. Now, no one else saw it. It's like the seer went into some kind of a trance and then came out of it and claimed to have seen Mary. So this is different than what we're talking about with the appearances of Jesus, of course, right? Where he's appearing not only to groups, but also they can touch him. He is fixing a meal for them. He's eating in front of them food that they had fixed. This is not even close to what we have with the Marian apparition. And the most impressive Marian apparition, I think, this one at the Coptic Church in Egypt. She never speaks. She never identifies herself. It's like the spirit that is walking around on the roof that people can see, groups can see. But again, they're just assuming it's Mary. The spirit never talks, never identifies itself, anything like that. Now, when Ken was talking to one of these seers, he said, "Did Mary ever speak to you?" A lot of these other Marian apparitions, she never speaks to the seer, the percipient. But he said, "Has Mary ever spoken to you?" And the seer said, "Yeah, once." "Well, what did she tell you?" "She told me to read a book." "What was the title of the book?" And so Ken wrote it down and he looked it up, and it's like it was one promoting the occult, Satan worship. And it's like, okay, well, in that case, it would seem that if this thing was an actual spirit that this person, the seer, had seen in some sort of a trance, that if anything, it is demonic since it was promoting the occult. So that's the fuller context of my comments here. This is really quite different than what we have with the appearances of Jesus. So I'm not discounting that Marian apparitions, authentic ones, actually occur in terms of they see some kind of a spirit being. I'm not a Catholic, so I'm not I don't know if it was Mary, but I'd be open to it. I don't have a bias against the supernatural. So my mind remains open to whether this was a spirit. If it was a spirit, was it the spirit of Mary? Um, I'm open to that stuff.
Okay, so you mentioned that some of these Marian apparitions are kind of vague and like fleeting visions. So I want to connect that to some of the critiques that I've heard from other Christians to the minimal facts approach. So I want to read a quote to you from Lydia McGrew, and she says the following: "Vague, fleeting, or visionary experiences provide a weak case for that conclusion that Jesus was raised from the dead. In fact, if the minimal fact of the appearance experiences compatible with minimal experiences, then paranormal explanations become an interesting option, which I gather is what New Testament scholar Dale Allison is exploring. Maybe there's just something weird in this world that we don't know much about that isn't a miracle and isn't a resurrection, but that causes people to have brief experiences of a person after his death." She goes on to say, "When it comes to arguing for miracles, both God and the devil are in the details. That is why it is dicey business in the area of miracle claims to set aside pertinent information and to waive contentious questions just because they're contentious. To see a strong probabilistic case aright, we must base our conclusion on all the available data. The existence of the gospel accounts and the evidence for their closeness to the facts are highly pertinent data to be taken into account. I therefore propose, instead of arguing from minimal facts, we should argue from the maximal data." So how do you respond to maximal data apologists and their concerns about the minimal facts approach?
Um, I think that it has some weight to what they're saying. If you do a maximal approach and you take into consideration the Gospels and argue for the historical reliability of the Gospels, sure, you get more things that you can use. Um, when it comes to minimal facts approach, I like it for a number of reasons. So, number one, when I was first doubting my faith back in the fall of 1985 and was introduced to Gary Habermas, he kind of went over the minimal facts with me. He says, "Mike, scholars debate over a lot of things. And, who wrote the Gospels? How reliable are they? How much of it can we trust? What were their sources? We can give arguments for all that stuff, but it gets really complex and a lot of discussions involved in that. And not everybody's going to agree on the answers." He said, I like to take the data that are so strongly or facts that are so strongly supported by the data that they've compelled a very large, if not unanimous, universal consensus of scholars to grant them as facts. And just based on that, we can build a pretty good case for the resurrection of Jesus. Well, that made sense. And it's like at that point, I wasn't an apologetics geek or something like that, where it was just my life. I just wanted reassurance of my faith at that point. So it's like minimal facts was really nice. Another thing is, when you're talking to skeptics, some skeptics are just uber skeptical that they will hardly, grant anything. I mean, you've got people who have, I think, a reasonable skepticism, all the way down to mythicists who are so skeptical they don't even think Jesus ever existed. So somewhere between here, you're dealing with some folks. They're of various kind of skepticism, degrees of skepticism, and they're not going to grant you certain things like the reliability of the Gospels. And no matter how much you argue with them, they're not going to grant those certain facts. But I can present some data, some facts, such as, okay, Jesus died by crucifixion. Yep, everybody agrees on that. All right, shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus. Yep, 100% we'll give you that. Some of these experiences occurred in group settings. Not 100%, but maybe you're around 80 to 85% of critics will give you that. What about the appearance to Paul? He's a persecutor of the church, and then he converts based on an experience he interprets as the risen Jesus. Yep, 100% will give you that. Well, you know what? I can build a pretty good case for the resurrection of Jesus based on that. Maybe I don't get bodily resurrection out of that, but I still get Jesus died, was buried, and then he's seen alive by people and individual and groups afterward. Now, if anyone has followed my debates over the years, they can see that shortly after 2010, so this would have been, um, or I should say, shortly after 2009. So, probably for the last 14 years, I've gone beyond minimal facts and I add in there the physicality of their belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And I provide evidence, several arguments for saying that the earliest Christians, when they said resurrection, they meant that Jesus' corpse had been brought back to life. And I don't believe there's been good answers to that. So is that a minimal fact? Well, it depends. What are the criteria for a minimal fact? Is it 80%? Well, you may or may not get bodily resurrection at 80%. That might be more like 70 or 75%. But I think the evidence is good enough that, in fact, I think it's so strong, I just put it out there to my debate opponents when I'm debating them and dare them to answer it because I think it's a really difficult one to respond to. So if you throw in the bodily appearances, and I can pretty much get there without the Gospels. Not that I'm adverse to the Gospels, but I like using those facts for which we got very strong evidence for it, and a majority of critical scholars granting it, if not consensus, a universal consensus. So, as far as the maximal facts approach, I'm fine with them using that. If they want to do that, great. I'm partial to the minimal facts approach, maybe because that's what spoke to me the best. They can do what they want. The difference between like Habermas and me is we're fine whatever you want to use. They're not fine with the minimal facts approach. And they're spending a lot of time trying to critique it. And it's like, Gary and I have just thought we're just not going to waste our time. We believe it would be a waste of our time to respond to them. We would rather just continue with our research in the various areas we're doing it. And so far, we're really glad that that's what we've been focused on.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you're willing to go beyond the minimal facts, and we talked earlier about the reliability of the Gospels. That's obviously something you're not opposed to doing. So, do you think that that's really the misunderstanding? Is that they seem to think that if you're a minimal facts apologist, you have to stick to this, the minimal facts, and you can't go beyond that?
I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I just don't, to be honest with you, Jordan, I don't pay a lot of attention to it. On this minimal, maximal facts debate, I mean, it's just a small group of people who are really, tied up with this, who it's a big issue for them. I don't know why it is. That's between them.
Okay.
I just don't care. To me, it's a silly issue, and I just don't want to take part in that debate.
All
Now,
right.
if it
So let's talk.
starts shaking people's faith, I might do that. It's like I debated Bart Ehrman several times on the resurrection, but after our second debate, some Christians were upset that during our debates, I didn't defend the Gospels. I just kept saying, all right, Bart, hey, I could grant you the Gospels are unreliable, but it has nothing to do with the argument I've presented for the resurrection, which you're not answering. Some Christians were upset that I wasn't responding to his attacks on the Gospels. So I did. I spent some time with, that and addressing him in those areas, his 5 major concerns about the Gospels. But that's because it was shaking their faith. I don't see how this argument over maximal, minimal facts approach would shake people's faith. But if it did, then I might want to spend some time on it to help them out. But other than that, I just don't have time for what I regard as a silly matter.
Okay. So let's talk about what Dale Allison wrote in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, about the minimal facts approach. So I'm going to read a quote from him and then I'll have you respond. He says, I doubt the power of the relevant facts to command a single inference that best explains everything. They are not infinitely malleable, but they are malleable. He goes on to say, when there are too many unknowns, one cannot solve an equation. And if from a jigsaw of 500 pieces, only 30 survive, we may be unable to ascertain the original picture. No single hypothesis best explains the likely facts. Those facts are too thin and too few, so that too much of crucial importance remains unknown. So, how do you respond to the assertion that no single hypothesis best explains the likely facts because the facts are too thin and too few, and so much is unknown?
Well, first, I like Dale Allison. He's a friend of mine. I have just a tremendous amount of respect for him and his scholarship. It's no secret I mean, I've said this on in front of him as well as in interviews where we both have participated, that I just think he's too reserved in some of the things that he says. In a technical sense, I think he's correct, that we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. I mean, that's the state of affairs. It is for virtually every historical event. Whether we have just 35 out of 1,000 pieces of the puzzle, I don't know if that would be correct. There are some things that we have to make some inferences on. So, for example, in the early oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, Paul, he's probably getting this from the Jerusalem apostles. Most scholars would agree that it goes back to them. It says he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500, then to James, then to all the apostles. So other than Peter and James, who Paul said he met on 2 occasions, Galatians chapter 1, Galatians chapter 2, it doesn't describe the 12. This oral tradition doesn't describe the 12 or the more than 500, or, the 12 or the more than 500, or to all the apostles. Doesn't say anything about the nature of those appearances. Doesn't even say anything about the appearance to Peter or to James. But what we do find from Paul is he definitely clearly has the view that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead. The Gospels clearly present the resurrection of Jesus as something where Jesus was raised bodily, physically, leaving behind an empty tomb. The majority of critical scholars today that write on the topic of prolegomena related to Mark say that the traditional authorship of Mark is correct and that Mark's primary source for his gospel was Peter. The majority of critical scholars writing on the topic today, they do not agree with the traditional authorship of the Gospel of John. Nevertheless, they still think that the Gospel of John was either written by a minor disciple of Jesus who had traveled with him, or that the author, whoever it was, used as his primary source one of Jesus' disciples, perhaps even John, the son of Zebedee. Dale Allison himself believes that latter one. So you have eyewitness testimony that's carefully rooted, at least in Mark and in John. And these talk about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So here's my point. If you have the Jerusalem apostles who are saying Jesus rose bodily from the dead, Paul saying Jesus rose bodily, physically from the dead, then when they are appealing to these sources, these eyewitnesses who had seen the risen Jesus, it's not much of a jump to infer that these appearances were bodily in nature. They led to the conclusion that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead. Now you say, well, wait a minute. They don't give any kind. How do you know that they weren't after the ascension or things like that? Because Paul's experience seems to be more visionary in nature than something he could have touched, like you find in the gospel. No, I'll grant that. But then we look at this oral tradition, and it seems to be a type of chronology. because the Greek that is used there either is talking about like position of importance or chronology, the Greek there. So you got the appearance to Peter. Okay, you could see he's the lead apostle, so that'd be important. Then to the 12. Okay, you got the 12 apostles here. That's important. Then he appeared to more than 500 at one time. Then to James. Okay, now wait a minute. We don't know anything about the 500. James was the brother of Jesus and became leader at the church of Jerusalem. Certainly, he's more important than the appearance to the more than 500. And so it's not of positional importance here. It's got to be chronology. So he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. That's what's narrated in Luke's gospel. Then he appeared to more than 500, then to James. Well, by the time you get to Acts chapter 1, before Jesus' ascension, or I should say, no, yeah, before Jesus' ascension, they're all there. You've got the apostles, you've got Jesus's brothers, and they're all together. And this is right there before the ascension. Well, how is it that his brothers and James are there? James was a skeptic before the resurrection. He was at least at Jesus's death. And then you come to right before Jesus' ascension, and now James is part of the Christian, the followers of Jesus. So it must have been that the appearance to James happened sometime after Jesus' crucifixion, but before the ascension. So you got all of these, and I would say then the appearance to James, the appearance to the more than 500, since this is chronological, seems doesn't take much of a leap of inference to say that all of these appearances would have been bodily in nature. So yeah, there's going to be some questions left, but the historians have to make inferences on occasion. As John Meyer, I'll just conclude with this. John Meyer, the late John Meyer, who was a great historian of Jesus, I once heard him. I sat in on a lecture of his, and he says, doing history is like playing cards. We always wish we had more cards. We wish the cards we had were better cards, but you got to play the hand you've been dealt. So do I wish, as historians of Jesus, we had more cards? Yes. Do I wish the cards we had were better? Yes. I mean, we got some pretty good cards, though, I think. But do I wish we had some better ones? Yes. But we got to play with the hand we've been dealt, and I think we've been dealt a pretty decent hand.
Okay, so this seems like a good opportunity to ask a question that I got on Twitter from Paulogia. He asked, for each individual member of the 12 taken separately, how strong is the historical case that they had an experience of the risen Jesus?
We'd say taken separately. I mean, the report is that he appeared to the 12. So you wouldn't take it separately. You would take it as a group appearance. And the group appearance is mentioned not only in this early oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, that likely goes back to the Jerusalem apostles, but it's also mentioned in the Gospels in multiple independent sources. So you've got Luke, you've got Matthew and John. I think Luke and Matthew are probably reporting the same appearance, even though it's in different locations. Matthew has it in Galilee. Luke has it in Jerusalem. I don't know why one of them changed it. This is one of the things that an unanswered question for me that I can't account for. I think one of them deliberately did it. I just don't know why. So you've got that. Then you've got the report in John, which I take, as most scholars do, a source that's independent of the Synoptic Gospels. So you've got the appearance to the 12 in Matthew and Luke, which you could look at it as a single source if you want, or at least they're using the same source. And then you've got John, who himself, it's going to be based on eyewitness testimony, since he was one of the 12. So you got multiple independent sources. And then, of course, you've got Paul, a third source that goes back to the Jerusalem apostles. So you got three sources here of the appearance to the 12. And I think that's pretty good. You know, if John and Paul are closely rooted in eyewitness testimony, and Paul had met with the alleged eyewitnesses, Peter, twice, and he met with John the second time. Um, and if John is rooted in the eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus's disciples, and Luke said he got his information from, it's a little ambiguous. It's either the eyewitnesses or those who knew the eyewitnesses, or probably he's referring to both. You got three sources here that go back very early and are pretty much rooted in eyewitness testimony. I think that's pretty strong.
All right, so Gary Habermas recently released his volume one of his magnum opus. I know you wrote an endorsement of volume one. Were you involved in the writing process at all? And what are your thoughts on the culmination of his decades of research?
Well, no one knows this topic better than Gary Habermas. He has been studying it. He's 11 years older than I am, and he's been studying it about as long as I've been alive, and I'm 62. He knows this stuff as evidence too. He's coming out with 4 volumes, each of which are an average of 1,000 pages long. Okay, so he knows this stuff. He's published this over the years. I rejoice with him over this publication of his magnum opus. Before this came out, he said that he thought my book, my large book on the resurrection, in his opinion, was the best that had ever been written on the topic. Well, now he's not going to say that because obviously his is better than mine. So mine, which is 700 and some pages, will be the Reader's Digest version of his magnum opus, which is probably going to be,
Huge.
over 4,000 pages. Yeah. So no, I didn't take any part in the writing of the book. He's really good. He knows his stuff. No one can really tangle with Habermas on the resurrection because he's an encyclopedia on this stuff because he's studied it for so long and he speaks with great authority on the topic.
All right, so you also recently debated Bart Ehrman for 7 hours. How do you prepare for a 7 hour debate?
Well, it's years of preparation. So I only prepared for this formally for maybe 3 weeks. And it wasn't a 7-hour debate. We had a lunch and bathroom break, so it was only really 6 hours that we debated. But there's no way you prepare for 6 hours of debate in just a 3 to 4 week period of time. This is something that Ehrman himself has studied with that and the various related topics over his years as a scholar. And it's something that I've devoted over 25 years of studying in my life. So yeah, that's how you prepared for it. But I don't know what he did, but I took 3 weeks, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks to sit down, write out my opening statement, create slides for it, listen to some of his interviews in preparation for the debate to see, what his most current arguments were, because he changes some of his arguments over time, which is okay. If you find out you're wrong on something, you change it, or for whatever reason, maybe you just don't want to argue something anymore. You just change your argument. So I wanted to see how he was currently arguing. So I watched that, and then I prepared some responses to how I thought he might respond. And, so I had all those slides in reserve based on how he was going to do it. And he wanted to share our opening statements with one another ahead of time. So I agreed to do that. I don't typically do that, but I agreed to do it. And so we shared our opening statements. And so we each were able to prepare our rebuttals ahead of time. And, to a degree, I think that's helpful because when you do that, you can have a more substantive debate because you're not necessarily having to think off the cuff. So, for example, Bart and I have had 2 debates on the historical reliability of the Gospels. Our first was a written debate. The second was live and in person. And the written debate was far more substantive than the live debate. And the reason being is because we had time to give further consideration to our answers before giving them. And so we could present them in a more cogent way, and we didn't have to just think off the cuff.
Do you think debates like this at this point are retreading old ground? What's the value of debates?
Um, well, there's so much that reading on these various topics. I mean, if you want to know about the resurrection, read Gary Habermas's 1,095 page book that you just picked up, right? Nearly 1,100 pages. And that just gives you the evidence. It doesn't deal with naturalistic theories or anything like that. Um, so there's books that you can read. But what I like about debates are the two people, the two debaters, are going to put forward what they think are the strongest arguments for their position. And so you kind of get everything that you're able to watch in maybe 2 hours. You're able to get what they think are their best arguments for something, and then how they would respond to the arguments of the other person. So I think debates can be wonderful tools for people who are looking for answers, but they don't want to spend hours and hours and months, reading book after book from both sides. They can hear it all in 2 hours. What, the top stuff is, the things that each person thinks is most important, and then they can reflect on that.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a few more Twitter questions. John Depew asks, if we couldn't arrive at plausible historical reasons for the resurrection, would you still be a Christian?
Well, that's a good question. When I set out on my study of the resurrection to do my PhD work, I thought to myself, if the evidence did not point conclusively to the resurrection, I could maintain my faith based on what I thought I had experienced of God in answered prayer, times of feeling intimate with God, just things like that. I felt like I could certainly remain a Christian if the end result was indeterminate. But if there were naturalistic alternatives that were far better at explaining the data than the resurrection hypothesis, then at that time I was thinking, no, I'm going to have to give up my faith because I don't want to follow something if it's false.
Okay, so another question from Twitter. This is from Homer's Theodicy. He asks, Lacona has said in a discussion with Allison that if he had been born Muslim, the evidence of the resurrection would likely not be sufficient to persuade him. Given that, why would he think the evidence would persuade a skeptic? And I'm not familiar with the discussion he's talking about.
Oh, okay. I don't know exactly what I said in that, but I was probably in the context of someone saying, is there any explanation to the alternative explanation that you find is the strongest? And I said, I really don't think that any that have been offered by skeptics are that good. I said, in my own thinking, I have to be honest and ask myself, if I were a Muslim, would I be convinced? Should I be convinced by the resurrection of Jesus? Or let's put it this way. Let's say I was not a Christian and the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus was not there. It was non-existent. It was just a story written down in one account and one person saying they had seen the risen Jesus. Would that be enough to convince me? Maybe, probably not. But what if, however you would quantify this, let's say the strength of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is X. And let's say the evidence we have for the truth of Islam is X. And the evidence we have for Christianity is Y, which is what you have for Islam right now, which I don't think is, I think the evidence for Islam being true is very, very weak. So let's call that Y. So what we have for Christianity is Y, and what we have for Islam is X. So it's just reversed. Would that be enough to convince me that that Islam is true, given my predisposition not to like Islam. Like, I don't like Islam. I don't see how it's played out in the world today. When you read the earliest extant biography of Muhammad, the Sirat Rasulullah, um, it's like, and you read some of the ahadith, it's like, I'm not impressed by Islam. I don't like it as a religion. So I already have this predisposition not to want to be a Muslim. Now, if Islam is true, then I would want to be a Muslim, even if I don't like Islam. Even if I didn't like Allah and like the way he was, I would still want to be a Muslim because I would fear God. So some of these atheists who say, well, even if Christianity is true, I would not worship God because I don't like him. Well, you might not like him, but you better worship him. Because if it's true, if Islam or Christianity is true, your eternity is not looking too good if you refuse to do it. So it doesn't mean you have to like God, but you should worship him if he truly exists. So I guess what I'm saying is, if I have a predisposition against Islam, but if the evidence we had for Islam was X, would it be enough to convince me over my negative predisposition of Islam to become a Muslim? And I said, I don't know that it would be enough. So that's what I've said about it.
Okay.
And I'm just trying to be honest,
Yeah.
about the strength of the evidence. But without a predisposition against it, I do think the evidence for the truth of Christianity is sufficient for rational belief in it.
And so, final question. I usually ask all my guests some variation of this question, but I'm interested in your response because I know you said you're a second guesser. You've dealt with doubts in the past. So, what would be your advice for a potential theist?
Well, yeah, all I can say is what I did was, when I was doing my doctoral research, I tried my best to take my own personal biases. I wanted Christianity to be true. I wanted my investigation to reveal that Jesus rose from the dead. And I recognized that this bias definitely had the potential to compromise the integrity of my investigation. So I put 6 roadblocks or speed bumps in the way to slow me down, to try to put checks and balances on my biases and to shelve them. It's like, put them up on the shelf and bracket them while my investigation proceeded. And it's like, we don't have to fear truth. What we do have to fear is that our biases will guide us so much that they will blind us from discovering truth and potentially cost us eternity. That was the kind of thing that kept me awake at night. That was the kind of thing that I tried to keep in mind throughout my investigation. And so there were times when I caught myself. It's like, if I were reading something by, let's say, N.T. Wright on the resurrection, it's like, okay, well, he agrees with my view. We both agree Jesus rose from the dead. So I'm going to read the evidence that he's providing, and how he responds to alternative theories, hypotheses. I'm going to read that real carefully. But when I'm reading something like an article or a book by John Dominic Crossan, with whom I disagree because he doesn't hold the resurrection, I'm just going to I found myself skimming through it and not paying as much attention as, whoa, wait a minute here. This isn't right. If I'm going to do this with integrity, I've got to read it with as much an open mind when I'm reading John Dominic Crossan as I am N.T. Wright or Gary Habermas. I've got to take his writings every bit as seriously and assess them to see, are these really good arguments that he's presenting here? And so I'd have to go back and reread it. So you put these kinds of things in the way, and you're constant. I found that it's not enough just to say, well, okay, I'm going to try to be as open-minded and neutral as possible. And then you start on that path. You've got to keep a concerted continuous effort to do so, or I found myself going back to my default position. And so for a potential theist, I'd say try your best to look at it from a neutral position. Nobody's going to be entirely neutral, but just say, I have no worldview and I've got to choose one of these things on the shelf right now. Which one looks most probable? They each are going to have their challenges. We know atheism itself has many serious challenges. So you got to look at the challenges and the evidence for them, and you got to make your own decision what you think is correct, because you have to live with that decision, your choice. You will die with your choice. And if there is a God who holds us accountable, we will be accountable for the choice that we made. So that means that if I'm wrong on my Christian beliefs, I could be held accountable and cost me eternity on that. And so this is something I take very seriously. And obviously you do too, Jordan, and many of your viewers do as well. So I'd say try to look at it as objectively as possible from all different angles. It takes time.
All right, Dr. Michael Licona, thank you so much for joining me on Potential Theism today.
Thank you, Jordan. I've enjoyed it.